Hello and welcome to the very first of our new series. Oh, am I live yet? Hello and welcome to our very first new series, which is the Mike McNair Revolutionary Strategy Series. We have got a very full house here today, soon to drop off and be just me and Lexi and Derek. What do you reckon? Okay, let's start introducing people. Who do we have here? Let's start with the new people. We've got Sophia. Sophia, do you want to say hi?
Hi, Sophia here.
Where are you today, Sophia?
I am in Arizona, the United States.
God bless. Yes. God bless the United States. Who's next? Who do we have? We then call over to, I think, the East Coast. Rosa, are you there?
Yeah, I am not on the East Coast at all, but yeah, Midwest gal.
Midwest. So, there you go.
Yeah.
That would explain why you're so boring. Okay, now. Sorry, I'm joking.
Oh my God.
That's what I do. I just insult people who I think I know, but I don't actually know yet. Okay, let's go on.
Everyone.
It's going to come back. It's going to come back. Rose is going to fucking zing me now any minute. Okay, now, who's next is, who is next? Lexi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing all right. Now, I am on the East Coast. You can tell because of my affected demeanor.
That is very true. Yeah, the closer you are to the Europe, the more intelligent you sound. That's what I say. Derek, where are you? Lingering on the West Coast.
West Coast. I'm lingering in the Rocky Mountains. Man, your understanding of American geography is really poor.
Are the Rockies not west? The Rockies are in the west.
Yeah, but they're not coastal. There's another like 9 hours of driving.
Yeah, but it's America. Shit, come on, America's massive. You got to get it.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So today we're going to try and get through the introduction of this book and maybe see how we get along in the first chapter. I was wondering if we just maybe let people talk a little bit earlier about their impressions so far of the book and kind of what they want to get out of this. So let's go back to Rosa so she can give me some grief for being such a horrible, miserable old Irish bastard. Rosa, how's it going?
It's going well, I guess. So we're reading Marxist Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair. Probably like one of the first books that kind of like broke me off from like left communism a bit. You know, just reading this helped me like, move away from left communism, or at least like hardline Bordiga brain rot.
When you say left communism now, can you explain that position to people who don't know the jargon or the lingo?
So left, that's actually like you have to go into like just some level of historical detail, because what left communism meant was like left of the common turn. I'm sort of applying it ahistorically in a way. It's like left of the common turn. So what you got out of this left of the common turn was like basically two distinct wings. There was the Dutch German, which was like sort of council communist, generally not particularly too enthusiastic about parties, more spontaneous in terms of like how the workers would like carry out the revolution, and they would carry out through like Soviets and councils. I hope I'm not butchering that. I know someone's like one or two people who are really into that.
So is that Panacek and his stuff?
Yeah, Pananok Gorter? Am I butchering that word? And then there's the Italian wing, which is like sort of just hardline Leninist, like Bordiga, and yeah, the sort of like hardline Leninists. And then you have like over time you have like sort of combinations of the two that end up being formed, sort of like attempts to synthesize like the sort of hardline Bordigism of like, Italian wing of left communism with like council communist sort of vibes, ideology with like the ICC International Communist Current, the International Communist Party, I believe, is another one. ICP.
Family.
Yeah.
The ICP, the ICT, and the ICC. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to do this too much because, like, we can get into sectarian, and this book invites you, unfortunately, get into sectarian micro distinctions.
Yeah,
but
let's not forget the ICA as well, which my mother was in. That's the Irish Country Women's Association.
Ah, yes, of course.
Yeah. And
the last true left communist sect.
That's true.
And then, like, outside of the weird sects, there's also like just sort of ultra left theorists who are like influenced by left communism, but aren't exactly like
don't have a party
per se. Yeah, they don't really have a party or whatever. There's people like Kamat who like went from being hardline Bordigas to a proto-primitivist, like one of the original primitivists. You have Dave, who's kind of, all on his own, I guess, or is he a part of like some theory collective or something like that?
Trupline, called Trupline.
Trupline is, and but Trupline's what, like 2 people?
Yeah, fucking. I don't know.
We've dived so deep into this stuff already. This is going to be a hard session, isn't it? But this is
let's focus on the question at hand, which is, what about this book? Why are you reading it again? Why join us?
And what about it like blasted you out of your previous like scenario, belief system or whatever?
What specifically did it was it just lays out like a relatively realistic strategy in terms of like building up a party, and it's more fulfilling to have like that long-term like building up of a party rather than like waiting for like some spontaneous mass of like workers to rise out of nothing, or just have like 5-person party with their dog, whatever, kind of phrase.
Dogs are great though.
Yeah, 5-person party with their dog or whatever, holding up the true proletarian line. It's just like I don't feel like either of those are particularly productive. Particularly productive on the left, and it's also an alternative to just straightforward like hardline activism that just gets ends up in just sort of like being sucked into like NGO work for the Democratic Party, or whatever the equivalent of the Democratic Party would be in like European nations. Although like I don't know, they're more like actual straightforward labor parties, whereas we have like a weird populist party instead of like a labor party. But yeah, it presents like a relatively realistic outline for a revolutionary strategy. Just I don't want to fucking repeat the title. I feel like that. But yeah, it's just it presents like a realistic idea of the party as like a multi-tendency sort of organization. Well, an actually multi-tendency organization, not like whenever like groups talk about like being a multi-tendency organization and they don't actually have any more tendencies than one that just dominates it. Like you're allowed to have factions in like a mass party, that sort of thing. And that seemed relatively interesting to me, coming out of like a space where it was like sort of dogmatic, like Bordigas would be like the big thing with a party, and like the totalitarian elements of the party would be the big thing with the party. I mean, Bordiga actually did argue for like factions, and like didn't he argue against the Bolshevization of of parties?
Yeah, he did. He argued against Gramsci on the Bolshevization of parties, but his own party stance, by the time you get to the PCI or ICP in English, is almost the opposite of that stance where you have like the true line and it doesn't variate and you just hold to it. And if that means 5 people are communists, well, damn it, that's okay.
The variance program, yeah.
Okay, well, like Derek, do you want to give a shout about what you think about the book, or why you want to do this reading?
I am a friendly skeptic to this book, and this also shocked me out of a sort of like communization theory path that I was going down for a long time when I got very frustrated coming out of Trotskyism. So to get into that a little bit, this book got me thinking about the seeming difference between party organization and its relationship to, but not dominance of, the class that it claims, classes that it claims to be representing. And so it's interesting because if you're a vanguard theorist, you can believe in this book, but if you're not, you can also still pretty much believe in this book. What the party looks like when they merge is different, but I find that fascinating. So that was a good wake-up call to me. My concerns are, and I'm going to state them just right out the gate, is there seems to be a concern with the left and not the workers' movement, where a lot of us who have thought about this a lot, because I was in a party that was inspired by this book for a little while, with Lexi, actually.
I think I was also technically in that party, although I was like the 1-member branch of Chicago or something really dumb like that.
Yeah, I was saying.
And I was at large. I wasn't even in the country. So the funny thing
not so large anymore, Derek.
Yes. I'm now at medium size. So the funny thing about this to me is that I both kind of believe in this book and want to argue with it. The reason why I want to argue with it is that I've never is macro, as I think, as much as this intuitively makes sense to me, I've never seen anyone actually do it since the First International. I mean, the Bolsheviks arguably did, but their situation's a little different. So when we go through this, I'm kind of going through it with I want to be convinced by this. I kind of innately sort of agree with most of it, but part of me is just like, but why doesn't anyone ever do this? Because it should be obvious. And why can't the people inspired by this book do this either?
Yeah, I think I had like a relatively same issue with it. Like a few days back when I know this is gonna, maybe I shouldn't say this on air, but I tried to email the Weekly Worker about like publishing an article that I wrote on like American strategy for building up like a mass party in the United States. Emailed it to them, and the editor did not receive it very well. You just like gave me like a two or 3 sentence response that essentially amounted to, "This is unrealistic." But like I didn't really mind that. I really didn't mind like, oh man, this is not how we want to do it. This is not how, you're not actually trying to build the mass party first and foremost, and that. But like the last sentence that like stuck out for me was, we're trying to recruit from the advanced elements of the working class that are in Sachs, and it's like rival Sachs, and it's like, what? Are there what? I'm just, and I was just like, I just sent like an email back, like I had sort of like a mildly snotty response to that, like, yeah, I'm not really sure if there are many workers in our sex in the United States, let alone advanced workers. I mean, I guess you could argue proles, but that's a more broader category than workers, maybe. But at the same time, yeah, no, that's
weird.
Well,
that's kind of
something
delusional.
Yeah, there's something that's in the text a lot.
Yes.
It's given out about is the sectism. But look, we had this problem we had as well with our climate series when we have this weird dichotomy between the politics and the actual the work. So I think we'll probably run into some of this. I undoubtedly, because I think if we're proper materialists, I think a lot of these people like McNair are coming out of a culture of truck groups and, fighting with Jerry Healy and the AWL and all these groups that nobody outside of about 1,000 people in England know who they are. So it's weird how it doesn't seem to be applied.
People know about Healy through like tabloids. They know about Healy. They know about Healy and his organization solely through tabloids because it was like
because he raped somebody.
Coverage went to that.
It was an incredibly abusive, like, sex cult, basically.
Yeah.
He was like a hardcore rapist. So it's like, that's why people in England. That's why some people know about him. But even in England,
hardcore rapist.
I'd say if you walk down the street in London and you asked 1,000 people, maybe 5 people would know who Jerry Healy is, to put it into perspective, But so anyway, Derek, what were we talking about? Oh, your skepticism is you like the book, but you're kind of wondering how come it hasn't been used yet, and that makes you skeptical. Is that your general?
Yeah, that's my general. I mean, since this book has been presented to me, I've been always like, well, why doesn't anyone ever do it? And I think my other innate criticism is, I don't know how you get to the merger formula when there is. It's not dead, but when the workers' movement's so nebulous and inchoate in a lot of places, and so it's like trying to like merge with something that is not self-aware or self-consistent, particularly in America. But I mean, I don't think it's just America.
No, the decline in the labor movement is basically worldwide in terms of like union numbers. It's pretty much worldwide.
So
I think
in like Western deindustrialized nations, it's like a general it's a general trend of like declining union numbers.
Well, I think I guess my answer to that is that, like, I think in a process of doing base building in a socialist org, like whether it's like a pre-party formation or an actual party, in order to do that base building, you do want to kind of participate in the labor movement and help build that up as much as possible, or at least support it. And so in my mind, that kind of creates like this feedback loop to where as you try to build your base for your socialist org, you're also helping out the labor movement, helping that get back on its feet. But maybe that's a bunch of bullshit. I don't know.
Well, the fear I have is that you try to create a labor movement that automatically looks like your party, from the ground up, and so you never get to where you can have multiple tendencies or multiple representations and really hash out the problems of the class, because you're trying to set down prerequisites before the thing even exists. Like, it's this almost Platonic model of a program. And again, that isn't addressed in this book. This book does address programism and stuff, but not to the same degree. And I'm just interested in this book because I both like and am suspicious of the fact so many different groups, like Maoists who are attracted to Hal Draper, like this book. Trotskyists who are attracted to Hal Draper, like this book. People who come out of the organization that I come back from really long ago, Platypus, were often attracted to this book. But those people fundamentally disagree on like almost everything. Right. And what I liked about this book is what I initially was attracted to Bordiga for, as Rosa brought up. Bordiga in the early days had this, like, you don't kill factions in the party because the party is the brain of the proletariat. So all factions and any group that can be fairly represented within the party, needs to be allowed to flourish so you can have this discussion that then can go out into the world. You know, in reality, Bordigo like gives, by the time he gets to the invariant program, which is pretty early, he throws that out. For me, when I read this, I see that, but I also just think like, are we at such an early stage that we're not even at this point yet? And the base building stuff is interesting, and like we will have to talk about this a little bit, but the elephant in the room with base building is you eventually need money to keep it going. I've been like when I was in Red Party, and again the party was inspired by this book explicitly. We had debates, and I wrote articles on that element of the strategy, and I started talking about how only really religious parties have been able to do it successfully, and that is because they had, you know, bourgeois bankrollers, and not just one or two like the Bolsheviks had, but like, you know, tons. And even then, there seems to be like a natural capstone that you hit, unless it's a war zone. So we'll have to deal with that. But the thing is, I don't know that, like, again, the strategy part of this is much larger than that. So I don't want to limit it to that discussion.
Yeah, although these are just opening remarks, right? Like, go on, Sophie.
Yeah.
I just was gonna say, like, as a quick response, I think part of it is that, like, I do think the labor movement is in a mild, I don't know, renaissance or something like that. Like, I think with, at least in the U.S., with like the teacher strikes and things like that, it's starting to wake up. And I think as capitalism continues to take its course, we're going to continue to see that. And I think that labor movement will dissipate without some kind of socialist party or socialist organization to, you know, support it. And so I don't think that base building will entirely subsume the rebuilding of the labor movement. And, you know, I do think any kind of socialist organization that's serious needs to be a dues-paying org. And I don't, you know, I've been part of organizations that do that, and while it can be messy at times, so it's been relatively successful. And you know, keeping a war chest, making sure that there's funds available to bail people out, and all that kind of shit.
Yeah, I think I would like just jump in to say I think we should like take into account that there's a difference between like a workers move, like worker and proletariat in terms like obviously, like, you know, throughout the history of like Marxism, the terms have been used pretty much interchangeably. Worker, proletariat, you know, that sort of thing. It's workers of the world unite. Just, you know, but like I feel like the proletariat is actually a broader category, even though like one could sort of like base it in like the worker as being like the most basic proletarian. The fact,
Yeah,
like,
doesn't McNair
right.
makes the point explicitly, doesn't he, that it's everybody who's dependent on the wage fund as opposed to just the workers in the factories.
Yeah, and that comes down to the problem of like working identity versus a structural position of the working class, you might say.
Yeah, so if we think about it in those terms rather than simply the workers' movement, you still see resistance on the part of the proletariat. It's just more scattered and more like frantic, I guess. Like we see it with like the protests and the yellow vest protests in France, rioting in Charlottetown. Did I say Charlotte? Charlotte, yeah, Charlotte. My bad.
It's all good.
Yeah, just like rioting against against police brutality, stuff like that. It's these sort of like spontaneous sort of like moments of resistance that just sort of like fade in and out, because like usually what happens is like the moment happens and then immediately like NGO types try to get in on it, and like the people who are involved in it don't generally trust like the NGO people.
Right, and thus it moves on to a college campus almost always. Like that's how that tends to go.
It moves on to a college campus.
So, Yeah.
Let's actually talk about the book.
Well, can we continue our introductions? You know, for why we're here.
Yeah.
Because I know y'all already talked, but shit. Like
Lexi.
Anyway. So it's good that you brought up the sort of like, I don't know, movement of squares, like autonomous anti-politics, like whatever those little tantrums that we get every few years that, was pretty much the exhaustive, like revolutionary horizon for the whole time we've been alive. So when Occupy fizzled out, when I started Occupy, I was something of an unconscious councilist. As I finished Occupy, I was so frustrated that I, thought Leninism looked okay. But the whole time that I was going through these things, I was looking for something that was not reformism, not Leninism, and not anarchism. I was impressed by early council communism, like I was saying, but something didn't add up. And when I ran into communization, you just sort of have to admit the reason that communization uses this sort of nihilism to kind of give you like negative feelings and like uses the toxic memes that it does is to psych yourself out of false hopes that are kind of obviously false. Marxists sometimes take refuge in history to think of times that were actually quite horrible, but because they were more tractable and there was more of an obvious struggle, there's something more satisfying, when we're reading about these times than the times that we actually live in, which is a lot more desperate and a lot more disseparate in terms of what resistance actually means. So when I never liked left communism. Yeah. What?
Lexi, could you explain communization for people who don't know what it is?
Yes. So to pick up on the tendencies that Rosa was talking about with the left communist tendencies that think that the party should abstain from elections, and then the sort of broadly ultra-left tendencies that think that communists shouldn't even really fuck with a party because parties are just for domination. There's a beyond the ultra-left, quote unquote, position where essentially you still take on Marx's analysis of capital and to some extent of history, but you essentially capitulate to Bakunin and say, well, Marx was just straight up wrong. This whole like creating some kind of bridge towards communism, that's not going to work. Anytime you do that, it's going to end up in a dictatorship over the proletariat. You kind of just need to skip to communism. That's what communization, broadly speaking, is about. And I was not willing to accept this. It sounded in some ways even dumber than Trotskyism or something, which I was around. On the other hand, it had by far the best scholarship of any of the politically, relevant tendencies that I saw around the feeding frenzy when Occupy died. It engaged with the analytical Marxists in particular, and that tickled me because I was always looking for revolutionary analytical Marxism. The thing that you really have to hate about the analytical Marxists, no matter what, is that it also kind of slides into revisionism. So I was convinced that these analyses could be paired with better politics. And in a way, the communizers, instead of doing Lassalle, analytical Marxist Lassalle, they're doing analytical Marxist Bakunin. It wasn't quite what I was looking for, but it at least maintained some kind of revolutionary horizon. So around the same time that I was getting into that stuff, I ended up actually just after I had done a reading series on left communism with one of the EndNotes people, I ran into this book, and it was the only book I thought that had basically anything, first of all, to offer that wasn't reformism, wasn't obviously explicitly Leninism, we'll get to that later, and was also not anarchism. And then it also had, I thought it had something to say about the way that we need to deal with these nadirs in the workers' movement. And, even if there's a possibility that we don't get like a labor movement like the old one in the future, that we're not going to be focused on the point of production as the locus for organization. We have to think more broadly about these things. McNair, I think, has stuff that deals with that more so than any other like Marxist in that regard. Marxist politically speaking. Now, the thing you'll notice about this book that I think is most politically relevant now is its subtitle, The Challenge of Left Unity. I want to bring this up because in the actual history of McNair's party, the CPGB, not the weird ML one, but anyway, they have a... Yeah, yes, of course, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Provisional Central Committee. They attempted a left unity effort that they chronicled in excruciating depth in their paper, The Weekly Worker, which is probably the best, like, you know, like Marxist party rag you can find, but it's also this sect minutia, unreal. But step by step, you can see that degenerate breakdown. Probably would be good for a study on small group sociology. Anyway, we also sort of have the fortune now of having our own sort of left unity effort with Marxist Center, of all the people that, you know, want to be left of the DSA that are coming together. I think that's interesting. The only thing is that in the UK, once left unity broke down, there was another group within the CPGB called the Labour Party Marxists. The Labour Party Marxists were sort of similar to the inside-outside DSA people. But as Rosa said, entryism into the Labour Party, which, you know, however bourgeois it is still in some bizarre way a you know, trade union party, versus the Democratic Party. There's something about Labour Party Marxism that broadly makes sense from this book's perspective. So once left unity goes down as an option, the CPGB turns towards Labour Party Marxism, and they end up smelling like roses for a little bit now, because Corbyn not only became the big kahuna in the Labour Party, but also didn't get elected, so remained in opposition, which is very important. And so the way that this, I think, intervenes with the Marxist Center that we've been talking about is, first of all, when they're talking about Marxist Center, they're using it in Hal Draper's sense and not as much in McNair's sense. But more importantly,
to be fair, they flip back and forth.
They flip back and forth, but they also have abstentionist people in there, and so and their whole strategy is actually around base building. It's not, they think it's kind of premature to look at program and party. And so we could look at McNair as a competing left unity tendency to base building. McNair actually thinks the important thing to do would be to programmatically, you know, consolidate party.
I think I think with the breakdown of left unity, they made a shift from, you know, left unity to Marxist unity among Marxists. And I think they explicitly leave out MLs also in like Marxist unity for that, for you know.
So by MLs we mean Stalinists.
Stalinists.
Yeah, quote Marxist Leninists.
I'm trying to use the polite term for them.
We should not use. We should use the real term. I'm serious about that, because like you know, what does Stalin really have to do with Marx?
No, I agree.
So I don't. Yeah. I feel like, you know,
honestly, I feel like
toxic.
it's giving Stalin too much credit as a theorist to talk about Stalinism. I mean, he was kind of a theorist, but like at the same time, he was a very crude theorist, and in all honesty, he didn't really contribute all that much. He just like vulgarized more than anything.
But Stalinism is not just a body of theory. It's the totalitarian form that the Soviet Union took at one point. And I'm not going to throw the word around and say the Soviet Union was totalitarian the whole time, but there's definitely a part that is an incredibly frightening exercise of power.
Yeah, I think of Stalinism as more appropriate to like the historical form and a historic turn the Soviet Union took after Stalin rose to power, rather than giving Stalin credit as a theorist, personally.
I think of it like a political style as well.
Well, I mean, well, what exactly does that have to do with the ML people who follow? I feel like they would have more of a connection to Stalin as like sort of a theorist more than Stalinism as like the state of the Soviet it was in.
No, that's correct, but I think that the difference
true.
between us calling them Stalinists is that they don't call them Stalinists because they see Stalin theoretically as just carrying on Lenin. And so I think Stalinism is a pejorative to them, essentially. So I think that's why I call it Stalinism, even though they don't, because they see Stalin as, theoretically continuing Leninism.
There's also an ambiguity between calling all forms of state socialism that took after the Soviet Union Stalinism versus like Stalin in power Stalinism. And the reason I say that is because there is like, the post-56, Khrushchev revision that is more or less a pivot away from Stalin's personality cult,
right?
But not from the state structure that Stalin set.
Right, that's what I'm thinking about in terms of like, Marxist-Leninism as being like something slightly more than Stalinism. Like there's definitely hardline
That's
there's
true.
definitely anti-revisionists who would fall into the category of just straightforward Stalinists,
Okay.
Or whatever.
No, that's an important nuance.
Let's get going.
Let's get Sophia's
Okay.
and Tom's introductions for why you're reading this.
Sophia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I guess broadly speaking, I started off as what might be called an anarcho-liberal. And then I was sort of a mutualist for a second. And then as I started to organize, it became more of like a traditional, anarcho-communist or whatever. And then towards the end of my anarchist days, I was some hybrid between anarchist and council communist. I didn't care what it was. I was just skeptical of, authoritarianism. And it really wasn't this book that broke me from those tendencies. It was actually State and Revolution by Lenin that broke me from that. Because my whole life up until that point as an anarchist, my adult life as an anarchist, I was taught that Lenin is evil, and Kronstadt and all the bad things that happened under him, was his fault. And there's kind of this like moralizing about Lenin. And then I read State and Revolution, and it sounded pretty liberatory and cool. Any cook can govern. We need to abolish standing armies and police and just have the self-armament of the workers, and a very strong emphasis on democracy. I mean, really, Lenin's what Lenin was hoping to accomplish, one of the things he was hoping to accomplish with State and Revolution was to win over anarchists, and it worked on me. And it was around the same time I actually started listening to Swampside, and that's how I found out about this book. I actually haven't finished it yet. This is really my first time through. I've read the chapters that we read today, I've read before, but this is all kind of new to me, which is odd because I've been calling myself, an orthodox Marxist or whatever you want to call it for a little while now, but I haven't read this book, which is kind of held up as like one of the primary texts of that tendency. So I don't know what to make of that, but I guess what I'm hoping to get out of this is just understanding the sect I guess I belong to, if that makes any sense. I mean, I have a basic grasp of it, I suppose. I'm not trying to sell myself short, but this is one of the main texts, so I feel I should read it, and what better way to do it than publicly?
Very good. Well, my I came across this book via Lexi, I think. And I remember like a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I think maybe one of the first times I had Derek on the podcast, I asked him, was there anybody who had done like any kind of historical kind of analysis of revolutions and strategies and stuff like that? And I remember Derek, he didn't put me onto this book, but he did talk about the analytical Marxists a bit. And I never mentioned it again. And then until Lexi put me onto it and I read it. And when I read this book, it's like the book not to say that I could have written it, but it's like the book I had in my head that I wanted somebody to have done. And to me, it's a very, very interesting book because he looks historically, he makes the point in the book that, we should be using our history for scientific understanding and looking what works and what doesn't work and what was a disaster and what was good and what's not. And he goes through all these different strategic and tactical elements and defines and talks about them and looks at the history. And for me, it was just like, I've mentioned to people before, I've been a professional poker player in the past, and it just reminded me like kind of like a game theory for revolutionary Marxism, and it was so fresh when I read it. I was like, Christ, I've never come across something like this. To me, it's always so easy to pick holes in stuff you might read. Somebody writes an article on this and you go, well, what about that? And this, and well, what about that? But like very rarely do I read like a whole in-depth argument and go, shit, man, like that is, this is extremely well thought through. And it seems to me to be correct. And that's what I like about it. It's like what I liked about the TSSI. And this is similar for me. Now,
yeah,
I'm not a historical person. I don't know the history like you guys know. I don't know the history of Russia. I haven't read Lenin. I'm not one of those people who knows all that stuff. So I'm coming at this from a position of a lack of knowledge. So I'm probably going to say pejorative things for people who are listening to it will think, oh God, I hate this guy, or God, he's watched too many Chomsky videos or something. And I'm fully aware of that. So, and that's where I come from. But so I'm just looking forward to reading and hearing the counter arguments and everything. But I think this is a kind of a classic, but it's not well known. And hopefully maybe what we're doing might bring it to the masses. Yeah, that's me done.
So I think we have an interesting spectrum of how we feel about this, and we're going to have to try not to get bogged down in our different micro nuances because they're definitely there. So Lexi, you mentioned why you were attracted to this, and
right.
And then we got turned on to it roughly at the same time. One of the things that's interesting is I've been reading the analytical Marxists since I was taught by an evil conservative Hegelian. I'm not going to name him because we called him. He was actually a sweet man, but he is a reactionary.
Hey, evil has great resources.
Yeah. I started reading McNair when I left Platypus Affiliated Society in 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. And after Occupy. And I hadn't read this book at the time, but I had read his articles, which had been very appealing to me. And it took me a long time to realize he wasn't a left communist, actually, because he had the same kind of snark I did. But
yeah, he's very sassy.
But one of the things that I want to get into, Lexi, is you brought up the issue here is left unity. And that's going to be sort of our background discussion is, I think one of the questions going to run through this with both the merger formula elements of it and the left unity elements of it is left unity really that great of an idea? And if it's not, is this book still in the main right? Because we might, and he doesn't say, for example, Marxism and how awesome left unity is, like the awesome unicorn communism of left unity. It is posed as a challenge which you have to democratically deal with. But I mean, I think I'm going to be bringing it up all the time, and I swear I'm not going to go into these minor sectarian squabbles. I promise. I swear. Tom's got his gun out. I mean, he's in England, so he doesn't have a gun. But like, whatever.
I have my Semtex. I've got Semtex.
Oh my god.
All right.
Does anybody want to hear an amusing story?
Sure.
My father worked in a co-op, in a creamery for dairy co-op, and there was a milkman who was used to get the milk from there and deliver it. But I was working the day. I was the last person to see him before he got arrested for the largest arms find in Irish history. He got caught under his fridge in his gaff. He had a tunnel. And in it, he had the biggest arm finds when all the stuff that came from Gaddafi sent a massive shipment of arms, and a quarter or a third of it was under this guy's garage. He had flamethrowers, Semtex, hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, machine guns. Yeah, so that's my milkman.
God bless your milkman. He's doing the work.
He got released under the Good Friday Agreement after only serving like a year and a half because he just happened to get caught late. Lucky bastard.
So I'm gonna just start us off then with the first question of the introduction, because this question is going to be interesting in regard to some of the.
We are likely to have another introduction coming up soon, but yes. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's keep going, and then we'll get. I think we're thinking going to get Ian Szabo in. So when we get him, we'll let him do his intro. But we'll keep going until. Oh, is that him?
Tried to send him a link.
Here's Ian.
Oh, he's in. Wow. Let's
see if you can hear him. Ian.
Welcome.
I don't know. What's
up?
Ian has appeared on Systematic Redness a few times, listeners, so you know him already.
Behind the paywall, though, Derek, is it?
Yeah. Well, everything's behind the paywall.
Well, not your old ones. Your old ones are up.
Yeah, but, from the ones from 4 years ago. Yeah, they are.
Try to listen to it, go. But so Ian, can you hear us, or is your mic working? There's no sound from Ian yet.
Yeah, my guess would be his microphone is not us. It's either not plugged in correctly, or is not selected, or is muted somehow. That's my tech support. So let's see. All right, let's go to the chat. Let's see. We got people.
People come from everywhere. Anybody want to guess the most Irish name of all time is a guy with the cough with IRA arms? Have a guess for his name. What's the most Irish name you can come up with?
Well, besides Tom O'Brien,
Paddy O'Flanagan.
You're half right. It's Paddy Murphy.
Oh my lord!
Oh wow!
and the IRA arms.
Could have been an O Murphy.
Okay.
But hey, I'm glad we got yeah. Oh my God! More than one person in the chat said Tom O'Brien. By the way.
Yeah. Finnegan. Oh, who said Finnegan O'Connor? For fuck's sake.
We got Stank. That's a good one. It's a good one.
Stank.
Oh
Americans have this thing where they call their children they take a surname, an Irish surname like Finnegan, and call it their first name.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Weird. IRA O'Brien.
Oh, yeah. Irish Americans will do that as well as a sort of like nationalist sort of gesture.
There's this weird tendency right now of all white people to give their kids Celtic names too. I live in Utah.
Who's this now?
Shit.
Cosmonaut.
So right. Donald. So
Donald. Okay, we got an extra joiner. Donald, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear y'all.
Okay, well, why don't you give an intro here until Ian comes on? Why don't you give us an intro on where you come from and what you think about this book?
All right, so I was introduced into the left by Occupy, the organized left. I had been radicalized by the anti-war movement when I was younger, but never really like got involved in the activism. And through that kind of wave of activism that happened around that period, I came into contact with a really fucked up Marxist-Leninist sect that was organizing at my university, Frizzo. And they tried to recruit me, and it was a horrifying experience. And so I was really like, and became really like, basically I became like a really big ultra left communist after that. And I kind of went in a more Bordigas direction, and I kind of was I don't know, I kind of just saw how it was kind of this kind of left communist like dogmatism was like a dead end. And I started reading more McNair and Weekly Worker stuff, and just reading like Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin and Zetkin and just like the classic like communist, and also reading about the history behind, you know, the German Revolution and the Russian Revolution. So McNair's arguments, and it just started making more sense to me, and so I kind of saw myself coming more towards like a Marxist centrist, like orthodox Leninist position. Like kind of like, I guess like a Kautsky, like kind of like a Kautskyan Leninism is what I would see McNair as like representing. And so yeah, that's how I'm here.
Okay, and we also have Ian in the chat. Ian, I've just muted you for a second here. I think I've unmuted you. Can you hear us, Ian?
Yes, I can hear you quite well.
Hi, Ian. My name is Tom. I've seen you on Facebook, but I don't really know who you are, but you know pretty much everybody else on the panel. Do you want to give a shout on where you came from and what this book means to you?
Basically just follow exactly what Donald said, because we've known each other online for probably about 5 years now. I also have a cold right now, so but yeah.
Me and Ian, we shared the journey from kind of left communism to Marxist centrism, basically.
Yeah, starting out through left communism because of because we didn't really like the background of starting. It's strange. It's almost like we didn't want to be Trotskyists, but worked ourselves back to an essentially post-Trotskyist position, which is what the neo-Kautskyan position is in essence, because you don't really have the neo-Kautskyiist position without the sort of Trots spending the entirety of the 20th century preserving the sacred texts and rediscovering a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. Like when I was younger and had Marxist-Leninists in my circles, like I kind of upheld left communism as like the true Leninism, like Bordigism as like the true Leninism, and that they were like the fake Leninists, basically, which was kind of, but yeah.
Yeah, and there was also just an attempt to avoid like hardline state socialism, and I think also there like the attention to orthodoxy, because Trotskyism throughout the 20th century itself was just, you know, constantly called you know, orthodox Marxism. There's also like a really good and a lot of Trots also called themselves the orthodoxy, because you can read a really good essay by, I think his name was Paul Kellogg, on the defense of orthodoxy.
Ian, you're a little bit close to the mic. I see Alexia said it in the text. Can you just go back a slight little bit, because it's getting a little bit of feedback?
Okay. This is also kind of crappy mic. So
okay, no.
If you're getting like fuzz noise, that's just the crappy of the mic, unfortunately.
That's better now. It's actually better now.
Okay.
Where you have it. Yeah. Okay, cool. And what do you make of this book? Did you like this book then?
Well, I've read it 3 times.
Okay.
Yeah, this is like the 3rd read I've had of it, and like just I don't know, I've read so many sections of this over and over again. Like I'm always quote mining it when in arguments with people and stuff. Like it's just, I don't know, there's single paragraphs that I feel like are just masterpieces of strategy and theory. Yeah, Donald got me to read this a second time, because the first time I read it, I was not as impressed as the second time I read it, to be frank.
That's a good sign for a book, I think.
Well, I also read this in a like a live reading group scenario with other fellow communist militants back in the day when I lived in Tampa, and that was a very educational and exciting experience because we had all kind of read all the left communist and classic Marxist stuff, and this kind of like it showed a way forward where you could kind of take this really principled internationalist Marxist stance, but actually make it work in reality somehow and actually make these principles like act out in the real world.
Okay, well, everybody's had a bit of a go at introducing and talking about it. I think, Derek, you said, will we start talking about the introduction? The introduction, it kind of lays out the entire book.
I think we should skip most of the introduction except for this one question.
Yeah.
It's literally the first question.
You read it there.
Should socialists join or support government coalitions, including people like Brown, in order to keep out of the open rightists? Should we be fighting for unity of the Marxist left on the basis of open defense of Marxist politics, or for a new mass workers' party, or for a party not programmatically delimited between reform and revolution, or is it wrong to seek to create a party at all? If we should be fighting for a Marxist party, does it mean it should be Trotskyist or Maoist or Stalinist or something else? And should we call for the workers' government? And if so, what would we mean by it? Should we be defeatist in relationship to our own country's wars? If so, what does this mean? These are the present political questions affecting socialists. Period. Done. And I mean, like, I think that does frame what this book is trying to answer pretty succinctly. And yeah, I think the rest of the introduction is like almost the Cliff Notes version of the entire book. So we can just go to chapter 1 from there.
Well, can we break down just a little bit what those questions are? Because there's a lot of questions in there. Cool. Sure. Like, so the first one he says is, should the socialists join government coalitions like the Labour Party? He's talking here in the book. It's basically politics and primarily UK politics. But
yeah, right. But this goes all the way back to I guess I'm going to be the history nerd here, but like this goes all the way back to like the classic debate between the German Social Democratic Party and the French Social Democratic Party. Yeah. Because under Kautsky and Babel's later leadership, the SPD was against entering coalitions and gaining ministerial positions in the executive of the government. Like they ran obviously for the legislature, they had a electoral strategy, but their strategy was not to enter government. Whereas in France, you had basically the Clement, it's his French name, but basically you had the socialists under Jean Jaurès, and that whole tendency believed in entering government through coalitions with like the progressive bourgeois Jacobin Republican types. And so you kind of had so in like around like 1902 you saw like French Social Democrats enter the French government actually as ministers, and that was really controversial in Kautsky and the German socialists. Like they saw that as revisionism,
I mean, I think for that first question, should socialists join or support government coalitions, including people like Brown in order to keep out the open rightists? I think I would say no, and that seems like a kind of an easy question that, although all of us come from very like broad and different backgrounds, I think I don't know a lot of you very well, but my hunch is that most of us can agree on that. Am I incorrect with that, or
probably unanimously agree, right?
Yeah, like I had an anarcho-liberal background myself.
Same.
And I basically let Stalinists bully me into becoming like a weird anarcho-Maoist, and then eventually I became an ultra-leftist to like get revenge on them.
Well, it might be worth actually going back to like what his questions are predicated on, though, and the idea of the independence of the Workers' Party itself. Because you can't, I don't really think you can ask these questions about exclusion and what the party itself should do without asking that. Because
yeah.
see a lot of.
So what is the party?
Well,
I think one of the important things here is like McNair's talking about, we need to win over, we need a principled unity of Marxists. When he asks the question, do we want a unity of Marxists? Do we just want a general labor party? McNair's arguing we want a party that's a unity of the best Marxist in general around the political program, not around the specific ideology. So that honestly means that like it would be a party that would try to win over Trotskyists, or try to win over Stalinists, even official communists. It would try to win over social democrats. It would try to basically, it would try to win all of these different like sectarian positions that we see to a more broad like Marxist program of fighting for a workers' republic.
You see, I agree largely with that. I think the key word in what you said, Donald, is principally, right? Like, so one of the things that in my background organizing with anarchists and traveling in anarchist circles is like the big fear about, you know, quote unquote left unity is that what that means in reality is just, you know, Marxist Leninists saying that they want left unity, but really you're going to follow their ideological line. And so, but I do agree that we need a multi-tendency principled, a party based on principled unity. I wouldn't include Stalinist within that. I think there's too much of a history of co-opting organizations and movements to try to fit their own very specific ideological line. So, I mean, other than that, I would agree.
This is my case. This is my case for why we should try to win over MLs. Is that a lot of younger communists, like, they basically just like realize the government has lied to them all about imperialism and stuff. So they're very naive and kind of jump really hard on the Stalin train, and they kind of see it as kind of a way to be rebellious against, you know, what they see as the, like, you know, what is the imperialist brainwashing of the U.S. And so I think a lot of these younger MLs are just like new to communism and are edgy. And I think that they can be, I've won a lot of like MLs over to like more Marxist centrist politics just for talking to them. And I think that like you have to make a distinction between like really hardened doctrinaire like sect like leaders who are just like trying to do entryism versus just like young kids who are, you know, or just people who are new to communism and think that being a communist is like being a Stalinist or whatever. Yeah, like, you have to be patient, in my opinion.
I think when McNair is talking about this, he's talking about parties and unity of parties. So I think he's talking about, you know, bringing in a Stalinist sect. From my point of view, these Stalinist sects, while they may exist on the internet, and there may be like 11 of them in some sect in London, they're not in any way a force in politics. You know, and it's a practical question. Not the individual. You can change someone's mind. That's totally true. But like when you take in organizations, like
we shouldn't be trying to like work with the CPGB ML, for example. But like I'm saying, like I'm talking about like at an individual level. But like say like for example the PSL, I don't think we should try to be like uniting with the PSL because I think it's completely corrupt and it's a racket organization. But
I think.
Can I just say something? Yeah, it's like we're getting bogged down here in micro sect analysis. Okay, this is not what the book is. It kind of has some of it in it, but it's the worst part of the book. So what we want to try and do is get more on.
That's a good. It's a good chunk of McNair's writing, even outside of this book, is like microsect analysis. And you know what?
Absolutely.
It actually is useful because sects illustrate a broader point.
Because he's trying to argue is that we need to like somehow move beyond this world of sects. Yeah. And I feel like the most toxic and the most like sectarian Marxist-Leninists are going to eventually isolate themselves if they become toxic enough. And if you maintain democratic norms and if you keep people accountable, like eventually these people will basically like isolate themselves.
So the question in my mind from the American
we got a couple people who want to talk that are just like, what do I do? How do I talk?
Yeah, okay.
Apologies.
Yeah, okay, wait. I'll do it. Okay. If somebody wants to chat, because we've got so many people on the call, what we'll do is somebody leave a message in the Google Hangout. We've got 3 people stacked who want to say something. So let's just do it in order there, and I'll try and manage it. Okay? Does that seem fair?
I'm in the Congo line.
You're anyway. On the top, Ian. Yeah.
I don't want to say anything actually. So it's just Ian and Sophie.
Yeah, I was going to link the discussion about MLs also to the discussion of the party itself, which is that you have to remember that the form of party which McNair argues is also a multi-factional party. And so kind of all the problems that might emerge from something like, you know,
hello,
framework of factionalism. Can you hear me?
Sorry, you just cut out again. Do you want to make that last point again?
Oh, I was just going to say that in a structural way, just through like the form of the party itself and the allowance of factions, it should deal with the problems that might arise from Marxist-Leninists, or as we call them, Stalinists, arising in the party itself. Because if you can't, as the person who supports multi-factionalism against the others, support, you know, build enough people within your own faction that back up your own arguments against the Stalinists, then you probably don't deserve to have created a party in the first place.
Sophia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you all. Like, I don't want to get bogged down in this for too long because I don't know if Donald and I will ever see eye to eye 100%. But I think I agree. I agree with the idea of one-on-one conversations to winning Stalinists over to like a more principled Marxist position. I think that's fine. I think that's very different than allowing Stalinists who you don't know if they're sincere or if they're just edgy young people into an organization. And this isn't just me abstracting. This is something I've experienced in actual organizing. You know, if any of y'all are remotely aware of the drama in Rennick Revolt, not getting into that too much, but basically a lot of this was set in motion by what seemed very likely to be Stalinist wreckers in the org who were acting very unprincipled and opportunist ways. And when you're allowing Stalinists into your organization, whether it's pre-party or whatever, you're playing with fire. And I think I through bitter experience, I don't really have any trust of them in regards to organizing with them. I think they're too dogmatic and sectarian, and I don't trust it. And that's all I have to say.
So to pivot a little bit away from that, but to take some of those things into account, but to go into the next question, for these questions, actually, the wording specifically come out of British politics. The new mass workers movement, Workers' Party, the party not programmatically delimited between the Ford and Revolution. Those are actually, I think, almost specifically Trotskyist, different forms of Trotskyist formulations. To go a little bit deeper into what's in the background of my head on this is I keep on wanting to apply this to American context, and when we talk about this emails and all this stuff, I agree they don't matter anymore. But in the 60s and 70s, there was probably 500,000 of them. I mean, if you read Max Alban's book "Revolution in the Air," that was the predominant movement of American communism after the Students for a Democratic Society fell apart. Part of that's because of Panthers, part of that's because of the RCP, part of that's there's a lot of reasons for it. And I don't want to get into the hypersectarian analysis here because, good Lord, that could take forever. But the question that actually does move us to the next question. If we are fighting for a party, and if we mean a revolutionary party in some sense, should it be Trotskyist, Maoist, or Marxist-Leninist, or Stalinist, or something else? I mean, I think the answer that we come to immediately as a preposition is no for all of them, or we would be Trotskyist, Maoist, or MLs. And some of us have been some of those things. Like a lot of the hostility people have towards Marxist-Leninists, I don't have the same background with them. I've dealt with them, but not in the same way. But I have some hostility to Trotskyists, even though I love Trotsky. So like, I have to ask myself that question. outside of my prior experience. And it seems like McNair, that question's rhetorical, because if any of those worked, they would have already worked. Like, it's not like we haven't had a history of like 1,000 Trotskyists blooming, you know.
Right.
Yeah. To kind of respond to all this, I agree with Sophie's read on, Stalinism more generally, that the worrying, concerning thing that one sees as a Marxist is that the petty, sadistic, bureaucratic tyranny or micro-tyranny of Stalinism, it makes sense when it's coming from people upholding a cult of personality in a brutal class society. Doesn't make sense when it's coming from supposed dissidents to that tradition. So, for instance, again, Trotskyists can do this. Anarchists can do this. Like kind of autonomous Marxists and Marxist humanists can replicate all the same sort of awful dynamics. It seems like there's some kind of structural problem with this kind of, I don't know, with the 20th century socialist politics, the revolutionary heritage that we have inherited, that we keep repeating this even if we're very ideologically opposed to it. There's a structural issue at work.
One thing Sorry,
Yeah.
Lexi. One thing I'd just say is that if you went into any like bourgeois party, the Labour Party, the Tory Party, the Democrats, I think you'll find all of those same types of behaviours in those too.
Well, that's true, but that's why those things will never be vehicles of liberation, ever. That's exactly why. And we, even though we have to deal with political reality, we can't just completely absorb ourselves into bourgeois political norms. We have to do something else somehow. That's the whole point. That's why we want. This is what a revolution would mean. We have to attack the state. We can't just go in and start, sucking out surplus. We have to do something different. And I guess I want to also work from Derek's point about putting this into the American context. I've corresponded a little bit with McNair by email, and he readily admits, I have no idea what's going on, over there in America. That's just, it's not what I do. And when I read the first thing, the rough American translation is, should socialists vote for Hillary to keep Trump out? Is basically what that even amounts to in our context. And that doesn't actually work totally. Because what Brown is neoliberal or something like this, or and Hillary is, I suppose, a neoliberal, but not from a Labor Party. So to make this rhyme, we have to treat the Labor Party like the Democrats, which is a bit rough. I guess we could also try to substitute, the DSA for this, whatever. But I want to actually downplay the role of ideology here. I think structurally, when you look at the inside-outside strategy of the Labour Party Marxists and the Labour Party in the UK, and the inside-outside strategy of the Democratic Socialists of America and the Democratic Party in the US, that the structural characteristics and the structural resemblance is of more importance than the fact that the Democrats is a populist party and doesn't have that labor heritage built in.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you find the same kind of wrecker activities in parties from Trotskyists or Maoists or anarchists, and I think that the problem with Stalinism is that it eats away at democracy and that it corrupts organizations. That's why Stalin was bad, is that he eroded any sense of workers' democracy and workers' control that existed in Russia, and created a model of socialism that didn't value these things at all. So I think just as an organization, if you value democracy and you have a truly democratic and accountable system, Marxism, Leninism is just an ideology, and if that ideology can't reproduce itself through kind of bureaucratic, like, fiefdoms, then it can't really become a threat to the party, in my opinion. Like, and I think that you have to have ways to account for that kind of bureaucratic degeneration from just like, I think, like, for example, I've seen like liberals basically come into communist groups and wreck them in the ways that like the most insane Stalinist would, basically. So it's something beyond ideology that we kind of need to develop a democratic form to deal with, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I guess just to clarify a little bit, like, I don't think we need to like have some kind of Marxist centrist, like, litmus test or dictatorship where we kick out somebody who might be vaguely an ML Khrushchevite or something like that. I guess what I mean is like the very open and loud, staunch Stalinists, we shouldn't bother organizing with them. And that's kind of my line in the sand. And I think for everyone else, and you're right, like Trotskyists and all kinds of different people can be wreckers. And I think that's why you do need some degree of centralization and some degree of some sort of principles or program you can point to. And when somebody's trying to wreck that, you can say, hey, stop doing that. You're not following our principles or our program. And if you continue to do this, you're gone. And I think that should be what we do, because there has been a long history of not just Stalinists, but all kinds of different people wrecking orgs. And so, and just to comment a little bit on Lexi's point, I think the DSA and the inside-outside strategy with the Democratic Party is perhaps more an appropriate analogy than voting for Hillary. I think, as a communist, if you want to vote for Hillary, just do it on the down low. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't something we should be telling people this isn't something we should be telling people publicly that, like, we have to never vote for Democrats or whatever. Like, there's a good reason why some people might do that. With that being said, I think like the DSA is probably more appropriate too, more appropriate analogy. And Ian kind of just in a chat said, a large party with fractions stops wreckerism. I mean, again, like, there wasn't explicit factions in Redneck Revolt, but one bad actor really derailed the entire project. You know what I mean? And that's a whole ball of wax to get into. But this wrecker basically, got a bunch of people to agree with them, and then went in for the kill. And Redneck Revolt hasn't really recovered since then. And it was,
I suppose
it was a large group that was democratically run, and it still happened. You know what I mean? So maybe I'm just, coming from bitter experience with this, and I'm incredibly skeptical of Stalinism of all varieties, including Maoism, or whatever you want to call this shit. Like, regardless, I don't have any trust for it. I've had really bad experiences with it. That's it.
I mean, I just want to add real quick, like, I've also had really toxic experiences with Stalinists, and it kind of drove me to this hard ultra-left, like, line. But, like, I think what the best way to just, like, kind of avoid Stalinists is just kind of have programmatic unity around being for world revolution as opposed to national roads to socialism and socialism in one country. And so that would basically exclude the worst Stalinists.
Okay, Rosa, you're next up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, well, most of the points that I wanted to make were already kind of covered by you guys, but like I was thinking you could draw this back to like sort of a way that it's like I know Lexi already kind of brought this up, but it's kind of like seeping into like just regular bourgeois politics at this point. And it's sort of a dynamic that you would only really find with like leftist organizations in general, like new communist organizations. A sort of like personalized dynamic of just like you know, wreckerism. It's just like everything becomes like a personal problem that you need to self-criticize for. The slightest differences become like a need for like disciplinary action to be taken. And you know, that sort of dynamic has been well documented by McNair. Not in this so much as like his piece on intersection. It's like series on intersectionality that like sort of traces like the development of like this sort of like a hyper activist.
Rosa, you still there? I can't hear you.
Might cut out. Maybe internet connection cut out.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, I think what Rosa was talking about though was Mike McNair has a series of articles on kind of how
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So anyways, continuing from what I was trying to say. Yeah, he basically
gone again.
But yeah, like McNair, he has like a series of articles where he's kind of like traces like intersectionality into like early Maoist politics. And so there's kind of like a sense in which like the Maoist New Left culture of the 70s has kind of been absorbed by liberalism.
And it ends up like cycling through back into like anarchist and general left circles through like this kind of like this awful feedback loop, essentially. Like, you know, they start working with NGOs and that sort of thing. They're already coming out of liberal backgrounds, and they just sort of take this kind of like politics, this sort of like HR department, social justice politics, and they try to apply it to radical politics right back, and it makes for an incredibly poisonous dynamic within organizations, even if they're not necessarily ML, even if they're like not ML or not like even Leninist per se. It becomes like a very authoritarian sort of problem.
Yeah, and Mike McNair also leans really heavily for explaining a lot of the problems that have kind of emerged around this stuff on Joe Freeman's really excellent essay, Tyranny of the Structurelessness, which explains a lot of this stuff in terms of the sort of micro-politics of these organizations and the structure of elitism that tends to emerge. Especially on the subject of, you know, obviously, like it's in the title, the lack structurelessness, causing these sort of interpersonal tyrannies. So that's also like an article that's really worth going into on top of this stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing about the introduction, I was thinking that maybe we should. Does this seem kind of right that he's kind of going to set us up for this idea of the different, like the kind of opposing strategies of the kind of MLs or the trot groups versus this idea of the social democrats. What do people think about that? Is that kind of the broad scope of what he's going to be talking about? Not too simplifying.
I think that's actually pretty correct. And that's what's funny about that to me is that there are other factors that you have to kind of deal with. Like, it's not like both MLs and Trots don't have like coalitionary theories. Like in Trotskyism, there is oh crap! United Frontism and with MLs there's Popular Frontism, and those things they seem not that different at first, but they're actually very, very different. And this tries to avoid a lot of those pitfalls.
Can you describe them, Derek? Describe what those two are and the differences.
So United Frontism is the idea that you can work with in a limited sense with bourgeois parties, but never endorse them. Don't give, you don't give them money. You have a tactical aim, and that's it. And popular frontism is you can subsume yourself into these groups as a faction within them, and sometimes even hide the fact you're a faction within them, like the RCP did with the Students for a Democratic Society in America, or like even like the Mao's relationship to the Kuomintang in China. And so the difference is how explicitly you make your differences known, and how much you're willing to like be in an actual overlapping disciplinary framework with those groups.
Well, can I add that like also like it would imply you would be in a government coalition with these people.
Right. Both of them imply a government coalition, right?
A united front is not necessarily a government coalition, and it can be just like you said, just a tactical alliance for a specific struggle. And whereas like you said, the popular front is different.
Yeah, so like Shiraza is a popular front, technically, for example.
Doesn't the specifically refer to alliances between workers' parties because it assumes already that the workers' movement is itself split, though?
McNair actually gets into this later in the book.
Yeah.
Maybe let's move on to the next question.
Well, the last question we haven't talked about is should we call for workers' government, and what would we mean by it? And of course, I guess that is yes, but that second clause is huge.
Well, McNair actually takes the rhetorical tack of, well, the workers' government slogan is a bad one, and which is a very vague way of saying something like a dictatorship of the proletariat has to actually be a universal state.
Yeah, the workers' government question is basically related to a very specific strategic moment of the KPD in 1923 when they were trying to basically come to power but have a coalition with the SPD be a kind of halfway house between the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think McNair gets more into that. But the last question was, should we be defeatist in relation to our own country's wars, and what does this mean? Which is kind of, that's one of my favorite questions, personally.
Well, I think
we'll tackle these one at a time. Sorry.
Oh, no, yeah. I think when it comes to being defeatist, later on McNair talks about how, like, basically he thinks the answer is yes, but people who take up this slogan or this position often don't realize, like, Lenin was talking about something very specific in a very specific time in a specific war. And so, but generally speaking, I think we should be defeatist in our country's imperialist wars. Now, what exactly does that mean is tricky. Like, do we think that the United States should just pull out all of a sudden from all the countries it's occupying in the Middle East?
Yes.
I mean, I would also tend to agree with that, but
yes.
What happens then in those countries is my question. You know what I mean?
Well, I suppose I think also you could make the argument about, like, should you support a bourgeois imperialist government or war against, say, a Nazis or ISIS, and we'd say yes in those scenarios, I think. So,
it depends.
I would say that
honestly,
against Nazis.
Against Nazis, yes. Against ISIS, that's a very tricky situation.
ISIS is very different, yeah.
I would say if you were an American, we should have been for the defeat of American imperialism in all circumstances. Like, I think I think that, like, revolutionary defensism is really only, like, applicable when you're, like, fighting a genocide like the USSR was against the Nazis, or, like, in anti-colonial struggles. I think, like, overall, like, in imperialist nations, I think, like, defeatism should be, like, the de facto position that we take.
I think so too, but I still think that in a case where you've got something like ISIS, where they are, to me, as bad as Nazis, and they are genociding people, defeatism there, that's a more difficult case to make for me. You know, what do you think the Syrians should be doing that fighting? Maybe
I
make
mean,
a
I
good
think
case.
that honestly, like I think Assad and Russia have done a fine enough of a job beating ISIS with in the YPG and stuff, and I think like it's just we should question the idea that our country has a right to be a police in the other parts of the world.
Well, I think
Donald's things that they created.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's all about undermining like nationalism as much as possible too. Like we want to basically like make people become anti-nationalist, and so part of this is undermining support for our own government's wars and supporting the idea that war isn't in our interest.
I suppose, but what I'm trying to say is, do you say that should Russia be helping fight ISIS?
I, as an American, feel very differently about what America does than I would. I know this is such a Chomsky answer, and you guys can call me on it. But like, I don't like Russia either. At the same, and in some sense, maybe they shouldn't be. At the same token, I have so little to do with that has like my opinion of that is completely irrelevant.
I mean, I just see it like as Lenin put it, it's just like a conflict between two slave owners over who owns more slaves.
Yeah, it's
Russia versus America.
Well, and I think Donald and Derek are really getting onto something here. Like, America is the imperialist top dog in the world right now, and so it does make sense in almost any case, especially now that Nazism isn't really in power in the same way it was in World War II. It doesn't make any sense to defend the U.S. in any imperialist endeavor. And, criticizing Russia for being involved in that, like, it doesn't really matter what we say as Americans. Now, when it comes to ISIS, I mean, again, as has been pointing out, like, ISIS was caused by American imperialism to begin with, but also, it doesn't have the same strength and power as Nazism did in Europe. You know what I mean? I think even though it may be as bad and it may be genocidal, I have a hard time. It's conflicting because I do want that to end, but I think it's better to because we can't trust the United States in anything that it does. Like, it might, the propaganda might talk about the most noblest aims of spreading democracy, of defending people from genocide and all these sorts of things. But our government, the United States government, is not going to be involved in any of these conflicts unless there is something for the bourgeoisie to gain.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that post 1945, all imperialist interference has kind of been put in these terms of protecting human rights and democracy.
Okay, I didn't mean to actually make it about specifically ISIS, but I just kind of wanted to make it more about I just wanted to tease out that question. I don't want to go down a massive row. I know that.
Oh yeah, we can argue about this more later, obviously.
Yeah, this is like geopolitics and all that. It's a kind of a separate question. Just a generic thing. Let's go over to Rosa. She's waiting here as well.
Oh, I was gonna go into more detail on the ISIS kind of stuff, somewhat.
Okay. Well, I didn't actually mean that. I wasn't actually making a case for America staying. Just let me straight. I think they should.
Right.
But I was just trying to make that generic point that some wars. I think in the context of this question, it should be said as well, is that McNair is talking about these overtly, imperial wars, and he also makes the case in it later for defensist policy too, whereby
he makes a case for Soviet defensism is the thing.
No, and also German defensism. He makes the case in there for when, if, say, for example, the British or the French were going to invade Germany.
If it was like a war on German soil, then yes, because the point is the German people have a right to defend themselves.
Exactly.
But the point is that in inter-imperialist wars, it no longer becomes a war that can be understood in terms of defense of a people against another, because it becomes a war of inter-imperialist competition.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I think Derek wanted to pivot anyway, so maybe we should just let Rosa and Lexi make their points, and then we can move on after that.
Lexi says move on. So Derek, pivot. It's time to pivot.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'll go with pivot.
All right. So I actually just want. We've gone through the questions, and there are some key figures that are going to come up over and over again. Molotov and Kautsky are going to come up. Lenin's obviously going to come up. But I think this. I really think we should look at the first paragraph of. I'm going to be the English teacher, right? The first paragraph of Marxism as a Political Strategy, Chapter 1, because I think it's something we really have to take in to the point of why we're even discussing this. The essence of a revolutionary strategy is its long-term character. It is a frame within which we think about how to achieve our goals over the course of a series of activities and struggles, each of which has its own tactics, many of which we would never, he doesn't say this, and I'm adding this, but it's definitely implied. Many of us, we will never live to see. So we have to think about this in terms of not just what we're building, but like what we're building towards beyond, the formation of whatever immediate sect or whatever we're talking about. And I think that's why this first chapter focuses so much on the First International, because in a very real sense, none of the people who set that up, well, not none, but few of the people who set that up saw any of its fruits. Like, they set up stuff that would happen later. And you have to think about it in those terms.
And I'd also say that like the situation of the First International is more similar to the one we have today, where the socialist movement is more of a petty bourgeois intelligentsia thing, and the labor movement is more is more separate from socialism, if that makes sense. That there's more of a separation between socialism and the labor movement, and even if we are seeing a renaissance in the labor movement, we are still the labor movement isn't exactly booming.
Well, yeah, Mike McNair makes that point himself later on. He basically says that like people want to talk about what 1917 all the time, but in reality, our current situation is more similar to that of the First International, because the labor movement is at a weaker point, as Donald pointed out, but also capitalism is much more global, with what's generally called neoliberalism, and that's much more similar to how capitalism worked or how capitalism functioned in the time of the First International. And not only that, but the labor force is more atomized as well.
Well, I was going to add is like you could argue that what people call neoliberalism is just basically a return to the kind of free trade capitalism that was dominant in like the 1870s, basically, but more modernized, obviously. But basically, like the capitalism of today has more in common with the capitalism of Marx's times and the capitalism of like 1945 and 1975.
Okay, over to Rosa.
Yeah, I feel like the emphasis on the revolutionary strategy being long-term in its character is kind of important, because like many revolutionary groups think of like just revolution as a concept being almost like a spontaneous sort of thing where they just sort of organize their like small little vanguard or whatever, and they're going to be able to hop on to the revolutionary situation where the working class is just going, engaging in real class struggle, and they're going to be able to hop on to that and steer it forward with their well-disciplined cadre, that sort of thing. Whereas like what is being presented in Mike McNair's, revolutionary strategy is something that you have to build the party you have to like set it up for the long term. You have to build up a base slowly through things like developing Marxist unity and developing like the both the S and the M of the merger formula over long period of time, and uniting it into the mass party and having that mass party like build up a base build up a base that's like able to really like meaningfully carry out a revolution, you know, when you compare it to the sort of like quick and easy kind of vanguardism of other, you know, supposedly Leninist organizations. It stands out in like great contrast.
So basically what we're saying is we will all be dead by the time any of our work comes to fruition. Are we all down with that?
Well, like
personally, I plan to lead the Red Army, so I'm just kidding. No, I think that's probably accurate.
Are you?
Like,
are you?
I don't think that.
Like we don't have a very long-term horizon when it comes to like environmental politics. So I agree with the broad conclusions of this book, but we got to get it together.
Oh yeah, I think we have probably like 20 years to make revolution before it's too late. But I mean, that's like still that we have to think in the long term. Like we can't have this attitude that, you know, like for example, the Spartacus League in Germany, they had this attitude that the revolution was coming, that Russia had started the revolution, and that, you know, these freshly like recruited militants were just going to sign up, you know, to fight on the barricades basically and destroy capitalism. Like, and it was that simple. We just needed to like recruit the battalions and go into battle, and the revolution was happening like imminently. And the German communists didn't have a long-term sense of building up a party that had hegemony in the working class, that actually had leadership in the working class around the revolutionary program. And so they just tried putsch after putsch and ended up just, you know, getting eventually taken over by the Nazis. And they didn't have a long-term strategy of building up a party and winning leadership over the labor movement.
I was just going to bring up the same point Lexi did with the ecological thing. And also, Donald, I actually have experience with firearms militancy, so I think I should get the leader of the Red Army. Just saying.
Yeah, you can have that. I'll be the Commissar of Enlightenment like Lunacharsky.
Let's be honest here. It's going to be a green army.
Oh no.
No peasant populism allowed.
Rip.
Okay, like we've been on over 2 hours. Are we going to do the full? I don't think we can do justice. I don't think we're going to do a 4-hour episode and go straight into all
probably not.
Derek.
The skeptics were right.
Yeah, like I think we should probably call it a day for tonight. What do people think? Derek, you sound frustrated, like we've just spent ages shit talking.
Oh no, I'm actually like, oh thank God.
Yeah.
It's like I'm like, so yeah, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna actually come in and do formal notes on a Google Doc.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing today, and I just didn't get around to it because I was out. But
and I'll share them with the people so we'll know the talking points coming ahead of time, so everybody can have a say. Because there'll be between 3 and 9 of us at any given time. This is more popular because it has less math, I guess.
Yeah.
So maybe we should do a math version of this. Can we mathematize it and then just get rid of the math?
I've been working on building out some models to make this nice and confusing.
Excellent.
I have some experience in agent-based modeling. I could fuck it up for y'all.
You're the person we really need. You're the person we really need.
We need tables. We need tables. We got to have table. All right.
Yeah. So, like, sorry. So I know I don't like to cut us off now. We're only like the Marxism chapter is fucking boss, but like we won't get through it all. So, is there anything we haven't dealt with in the introduction before we call it a day? Is there anything that stuck out there that somebody wanted to talk about, but we haven't done an excellent pivot towards? It sounds like Dances with the Stars.
There is the ending where.
The ending.
Well, no, the end to the sorry, spoilers. The end to the introduction that briefly touches on.
Yes.
I think this briefly maybe shows his hand a little bit. the only person who would not want to make the generalization Leninist is probably a Leninist, right? Someone that wants to dispute the nominalist kind of claim to Leninism. So I feel like that he shows his hand a little bit here, and that even though he has a fairly damning view of what actually occurred during the Russian Revolution, he more or less says that the only available options were red dictatorship and white dictatorship, which I think is it.
Is that correct, do you think? I when I was reading it, I found that
really
a bit.
Don't. But the only thing that makes me think, let's say that is correct, it kind of opens the door to wondering if the February Revolution was a mistake. Like, if, it was just going to end in bloody dictatorship, maybe they just should have kept the Tsar. Like, if there was no possibility of emancipation. Like,
but let's just read.
You just have to accept that Tsar, you have to swallow the tough and hard pill that Stalinism was, in fact, an advance over Tsarism in terms of, moving to modernizing society. Like, it's a point that even Bordiga makes, forward the barbarians, as he says.
Or Trotsky makes the point that if the Russian Revolution had lost, then the word for fascism would have been Russian instead of Italian.
Yeah, like,
No,
you could even make the same point about, like, Napoleon Bonaparte in relation to the French Revolution. Like, yeah, obviously it was a step backwards in terms of, like, the French Revolution, but, like, Napoleon and his conquest would do things like, get rid of, like, the weird anti-Semitic laws that, like, held Jews back and things like that were relatively progressive, and he was sort of the, like, high enlightenment sort of despotic, enlightened despot, figure.
Yeah, I think the Russian Revolution.
It's all well and good to be historic. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think one thing that's worth reading on this topic is Walter Rodney's book on the Russian Revolution. It's a book of essays that he wrote kind of on the importance of Bolshevism to the Third World. And it kind of shows how, in long term, what the Russian Revolution really contributed to the world was more so decolonization than the first, real working socialism. And that the real long-term historical political impact of the USSR is kind of this, it was anti-colonialism. And so, I just think that, we have to admit that, yes, the Russian Revolution ultimately didn't live up to its ideal of world socialism, but its impacts on world history were still overall progressive. And so I think that the October Revolution was justified, even considering how it ended up.
Well, I was putting that forward because I obviously don't think the February Revolution was a mistake. I think you have to bring into the question the possibility of human action causing mismanagement of a situation that could have been better. And I think what you see in 1918 is precisely that kind of thing. And I think it's a weirdly damning structuralist thing to do, to leave that out. It kind of implicates revolution as being stupid, when I think it could turn out better, even in some desperate situations.
I mean, I think a lot of the excesses of the Red Terror and arbitrariness was just something that kind of exploded out of the working class, and it wasn't. I don't really think that we can just. I don't think that we can blame the violence and authoritarianism of the Russian Revolution on Lenin per se, because
it's almost not the violence that I'm most concerned with here, but the inability to tolerate actual democracy.
Well, I think that, for example, the Soviet Union up until 1921 was a relatively democratic nation. And even if you go back to bourgeois nations under similar situations of stress, they go through sort of a same situation in terms of how they deal with civil liberties. For example,
it's
Abraham
it's
Lincoln
the French Revolution, basically. It's the same kind of situation. You had an internal civil war, and you had an imperialist siege, basically. And it's actually interesting if you look at how the Bolsheviks initially dealt with dissidents. They actually like let their first prisoners go after like 6 months, and then those prisoners, and they were like ex-Mensheviks, went on to go form a White Guard group, and then Lenin got shot, and then that's when you started seeing the reprisals and the terrors and kind of the institutionalization of all that.
Stack. Let's keep an eye on the stack here. Let's not get down these little sorry, Donald, I'm picking you up on it, but we're going caught off guard. One thing I would like to say here, I am next in the stack, so sorry about that. But one thing I'd like to say is that I don't like these ideas. I'm always wary when I hear a dichotomy like that, when I read that paragraph, because I often feel like there can be false dichotomies. And am I not right in saying that one of the options that they had at the time was going towards a social democrat kind of development? So to say that the idea was white terror or red terror is not a true false dichotomy. That is even talked about internally.
Can you repeat the line? Did you just? I'm sorry. I think I misheard. Did you say that it was the decision of the Social Democrats to go to war?
No, I'm saying that there was also this idea that they could have gone to a social democrat SPD development. That they discussed that choice. That it's not like there was only 2 choices. It wasn't just like there was red terror, white terror.
They couldn't have done that. They would have handed over, the Mensheviks would have handed over power to the cadets, who would have handed over power to the conservatives, who then would have handed over power to Kolchak.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes.
That's basically what happened. Was Lenin actually was open towards forming a coalition with the Mensheviks, but the Mensheviks said that they would only do it if they put Kerensky back in power and ended the rule of the Soviets. And so it was like, it's a little bit more complicated than like the Bolsheviks just didn't tolerate.
They also made the demand that Trotsky and Lenin leave their party too, which is kind of an absurd thing to demand even.
Well, that's fair enough. Yeah, like obviously I don't know the history like you guys people do, so it's like I apologize. But I'm just always wary when I read a dichotomy. I'm always wary that it's a false one. That's why I said it.
Yeah, Lexi, no, it's a completely reasonable thing to be afraid of. But the history is there, I think.
There is one the very last paragraph of this thing is also something I think that we should discuss. Lexi, do you want to read this paragraph, because I think it's said very well? Is Lexi alive? I can
read it.
Donald, you read it.
The use of hindsight is justifiable and necessary because the point of the whole exercise is to study the history for what it can tell us about where we are now, how we got there, and where we should try to go next. In this sense, it is loosely analogous to the sort of exercise that has to be undertaken if a bridge falls down. Why did the bridge fall down? If it was hit by a meteorite, we may well rebuild it in exactly the same form. But if the collapse was caused by problems that will predictably reoccur in the future, like severe storms and increased weight of traffic, we should redesign the bridge in light of the hindsight to meet these problems. In fact, that the problems which caused the collapse may not have been originally predictable effects for the moral responsibility of the original designers, but it does not in the least alter our present tasks. So yeah, I think that is actually one of my favorite paragraphs from this book, because it kind of sums up how I look at trying to learn from history.
And he's making
apply these lessons in modern politics.
So at some point, McNair also talked about how the physical sciences, we're supposed to be materialists, right? So the physical sciences a lot of times they have a laboratory they can work in, right? But we don't have that. What we have is history. And yeah, sorry, I only jumped in because Stack has been ignored for a while now. So
yeah, bro's got to obey Stack. Just saying.
Derek, are you next in this stack?
Yeah. So I actually do like the hindsight justification, and I was gonna say that I broadly agree with the characterization of the Civil War being made. by Donald and Ian. There are other turning points, though, and also the explanation that I've never found really satisfying, and I've even got it from Lars Lee, who's one of the reasons why I read this book, is that there's always as soon as the war stuff is going to stop, we can have the Constituent Assembly back, and yet we never ever get to that point, even after the Civil War is won. So you can turn necessity into a justification for pretty much anything, but you have other things to compare it with. You had the same justification made by the Jacobins, who then proceeded to, lay the way for Bonaparte. And you have similar problems with the U.S., but in the opposite direction because of the inability to do that with Reconstruction. Here we're talking about the Civil War, which is, I guess, the U.S. model for a time period where you had a suspension of bourgeois liberty. So I do think we need to have the hindsight, and I completely agree there. But I also think we have to be careful about the motivatedness of painting everything as if it was the only outcome. As a side note, though, in some ways, this is all irrelevant now, except in the position. And if you're going to do this and look at this and try to come up with current strategies, what could you do early on to not get in that pincer that the Bolsheviks found themselves in 1921? And I guess that's the big question that you have to ask when you think about this from a long-term strategic point, is what are we building for, so we don't always end up in that same cul-de-sac, or in the case of the German Revolution, not there in the first place.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and I think it's weird that that McNair's talking about hindsight here, but just before he was drawing this false dichotomy, and I agree, that paragraph is a false dichotomy. There's a lot of ways that could have turned out. It could have become, a social democracy. You could have had the workers' opposition take up steam. You could have just had the February Revolution. There's a lot of things that could have happened. The one thing I do disagree with, though, is that I hate the way that anarchists talk about the failures of the Bolshevik Revolution and make it out to be like Lenin and Trotsky are these epitomes of moral evil. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I think at the same time, there was decisions made that did set the wheels in motion for what is to come later. You know what I mean? And I also agree that a lot of the other socialist parties, almost, I guess as far as I know, all of them really were going in reactionary directions, from what you all were talking about with the Mensheviks to the left SRs blowing shit up, I think they deserve some of the blame as well, actually, because that's not the right way to go about things, in my opinion. But even if you were to ban all other socialist parties because these socialist parties keep acting in these reactionary ways, I don't think it was necessary to ban different factions within the party, nor was it necessary to tear down the Soviets. So I don't think Lenin deserves the Cold Scare kind of treatment, the Red Scare kind of treatment that he gets. But I also think he doesn't deserve to be held up as the pillar of liberty, because he wasn't, And again, Derek said something to the effect that necessity can sometimes be used as an excuse, right? There was very tragic and very difficult and harsh conditions that they were under. I don't think anyone's debating that. But it seems like at a certain point, it just becomes a way to absolve some of the Bolshevik leaders for their mistakes, in my opinion. And I think that is where the nuance of hindsight needs to come in, right? It wasn't this false dichotomy between white terror and red terror, and it wasn't this idea that Lenin was a good boy, Lenin was a bad boy. Like, it's more nuanced than all of these dichotomies.
Okay, taking it slightly away from this analysis that I kind of kicked off there, I was liking to go. What I really like about this idea of this paragraph is how it's kind of like it's trying to get this book and our analysis scientific. You know, it's this idea of analyzing history and getting towards it and being analytical and studying what are the problems and studying how you would go and fix this. You know, the idea, this thing of history, we can't set up experiments, but we can look at what happens. And for me, this is like a really succinct and good metaphor. And it really, you know, I think McNair shows a great ability to boil down complex ideas and analyses very, very well. And I just really like his style of writing. In some places it gets a bit some places I don't like it, but I just love this element. This is like, you know, this is like McNair as being an engineer, and like we need some fucking engineering instead of like, you know, critical theory. We need some fucking engineers. I don't know. I'm a nerd. Who's next? What was it?
I am, yeah. So I kind of want to go back to the topic of like revolutions and where to draw the lines in terms of like civil liberties and that sort of thing. I feel like I don't know if there's really anything that you can do per se to like prevent, like in a situation like that, letting like necessity become like a sort of snowball, like a sort of like downward spiral into just straightforward dictatorship, because like there are definitely situations where you end up like you end up in a you end up with a position of power in a state of emergency, just bourgeois democracies in general, where you end these bourgeois democracies end up doing things that are kind of really sketchy in a time of emergency. For example, um, with the United States during World War II, FDR and government basically ordered the rounding up of Japanese into internment camps and took away their property and essentially put them in these really crummy internment camps for the entirety of World War II. Well, obviously, this is kind of a major totalitarian violation of civil liberties. And under FDR, during like this really long and extended period of emergency, like we're talking like how many 10 years, at least 10 years, like he like had like 4 different terms or something like that. I can't remember the specifics, but like he was just like he was going through the United States in just this long period of emergency from the Great Depression to World War II. Yet the United States didn't really end up being like a dictatorship in the end. And I don't know if that's like a testament to bourgeois democracy or something like that, but I feel like it's more of a matter of like what people might call luck or like randomness in history. It's like you're making a really big bet with any kind of emergency situation where you have to like clamp down on like power and expand the powers of like an executive branch and just make all these orders that, you know, some of them you're definitely going to regret, and doubly so for like a revolutionary government. But yeah, I don't feel like there's any way to like foolproof it from like just turning into straightforward dictatorship, honestly. Maybe it comes down to leadership. I don't know.
Well, I think we need to actually look at the example of what happens in the Russian Revolution, where you do have this period of war communism, and you know there's requisitions from the peasants, and then there's a red terror because of resistance that this policy promotes. But ultimately, the Bolsheviks are able to carry through. The economy is able to, even though there's negative growth and stuff, like it actually you know, if you read like, you know, the economic histories and stuff, you see that like as, you know, in 1917, the year 1917, the Russian economy was being sabotaged by the bourgeoisie and being destroyed. Like crops are just, you basically had like such an utter disequilibrium, as Bukharin says, that the policies of war communism, of coercion, were basically part of what it was necessary to kind of reestablish what he saw as the NEP, and as you know, as he saw as basically war communism was necessary. But then you had what was the new economic policy, and you actually did see significant liberalization during that period, where you didn't have like this. You had a fairly pluralist educational culture, pluralist. You had the Soviets actually did have some impact. That the workplaces actually did have some level of self-management. And I think it was then when the Bolsheviks could have started moving in a more socialist direction. But what happened was Stalin eventually took power and closed off the possibility of that happening. But I think that there is a potential that after the Civil War, the Soviet Union could have gone in a more democratic direction. And I think that the ideas of Bukharin kind of signified that direction. But instead, the ideas of Stalin kind of won out. But anyway, I also wanted to say about this the science thing. I totally agree with Tom that we need more science Marxists, and then we need Adorno wink nonsense like just the fact that so many more Marxists are in literary programs rather than science programs is just it's the opposite of what it used to be when there actually was like a workers' movement led by Marxists. Like you actually had like Marxists who were in STEM and stuff. Like we need the ways of culture war for the sciences, as our friend Cole at the Dark Stars points out.
Am I up?
You are.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I also obviously totally agree with like the science aspect that Tom and Donald was just talking about, and I think that's really what we're doing here. These conversations are connected. We're looking at what happened in the past and trying to parse out like what really happened and as empirical as a way as possible, and then use that to inform our trajectory. And in that spirit, I do want to push back a little bit against what Rosa was talking about. I think if in situations that are incredibly dire, are we just doomed to despotism? Are we just doomed to repeat the same thing as Stalin? Because to me, I don't necessarily think that necessarily is correct. I still think even under the very harsh conditions of the Russian Revolution, there were things that could have been done differently that weren't. There were decisions that were made that did set the stage for Stalinism. And so I don't think we have to, obviously, under dire situations, it might not be 100% egalitarian or liberatory or whatever, but I don't think you have to make as many sacrifices as were made. So if I'm misrepresenting your position, I apologize, but that's kind of what I got. That's kind of what I got from that. And I think really like that kind of is also a false dichotomy. Like if you're under harsh conditions, then you have to get to despotism. Is not it's not a sound argument in my opinion, right? Like there are other decisions that can be made. So I feel like that kind of misses the point of this exercise of examining history. There was this kind of this story that kind of illustrates this. That I remember this one time I was criticizing the DPRK, and somebody sent me a link that said, the DPRK, everything that the DPRK is criticized for, the U.S. does and does worse in a lot of cases. And this is kind of in relationship to comparing despotism to like despotism under bourgeois democracies, right? So in my opinion, like, so what? So what if like if the U.S. is worse than a DPRK? To me, like any kind of society worth defending, any kind of, government or dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever that is worth defending, shouldn't it just be like mildly better than the United States? Like that to me, that completely defeats the purpose. And again, if I'm misrepresenting what you said, I apologize, but I don't know. I'm just not really on board with that comparison to bourgeois democracy and their despotism, and I don't think it's necessary to fall into despotism. And my last point is I do agree with Donald that the sticking with the NEP was a better strategy than forced collectivization. But I think in reality there were still decisions that were made. There were still anti-democratic decisions that were made by Bolshevik party leadership that led to Stalinism. And it's true that Lenin hated the direction it was going towards the end of his life, but he is partly to blame, and not just him, but like the decisions that were made by the Bolshevik party and as a whole that were anti-democratic allowed this to happen. And I don't think we can just ignore that.
Yeah. I mean, I think McNair might just ultimately be a bit inconsistent on this score. It blows me away that McNair is apparently some sort of Leninist. I can see it through the way Donald sees this, but even for like a crypto analytical Marxist, that I always say that, right? But again, he does write in this way. He sort of bears a stamp of a sort of Trotskyist apologism, and it's not like unthought out, but later in the book, he makes historical comparisons that I think should lead to the conclusion, or at least led me to the conclusion, that there are options in history. Leadership matters, as Rosa started to get at. Lincoln did suspend democratic freedoms during the Civil War, but he bent over backwards to keep democratic norms within, friendly territory, you might say. Washington during the Revolution had to deal with grain requisition problem and chose not to do them and to endure the hunger because the morale crushing would have been worse from requisitions. McNair makes these comparisons himself. So I have trouble understanding how he could regurgitate something like this when I take that evidence, and that is, this made me not a Leninist, essentially. When I was approaching it, I was, and then when I really thought this through, I was no longer. Ultimately, the cash value for a lot of this to me is that, we can all have a relativist part of us because Marxism has that historical materialist theory. And yes, there are things that need to be achieved in history, etc. But for our project today, to look towards social democracy or Leninism, we have to do it very, very, very critically. I even feel like that's understating it. We need to not do this again. We need to do something else. And I really don't like the attitude that, there's nothing to be gained from looking at the 20th century. Our historic break makes it that all this is completely useless and garbage, and we don't need to look at it. But there is something worthwhile in attitude from there. And I think the analytical Marxist point of view enables us to go back into history with a knife and not, searching for our Sorelian daddy.
Ian, are you up next?
Yeah, sorry, my mouse wasn't cooperating. Yeah, no, I was gonna go back on Sophie's point, or Sophia's point that that the sense that we're sort of doomed to despotism, and just referring to a point that McNair made in a lecture once, he pointed out that there is a there's a weird tendency when new social forms emerge, where it is going to be intensely despotic. The example he gives is the emergence of the Florentine Republic during the 15th century, which then you know, turns into a sort of, I mean, they had a secret police and all that kind of stuff. And then after it falls, very much like the fall of the Soviet Union, is followed by 100 years of kind of monarchical triumphalism. And so like I could definitely imagine like a very similar thing kind of emerging, you know, after 100 years of socialism kind of being in the cold, just as I suppose capitalist democracy spent 100 years in the cold. It could very well be the case that we do see like a kind of reemergence. And I would also point out the problem with the thing about leadership. This is just something I've noticed, and a sort of observation I've noticed about parties, and not just parties, but probably also like large conglomerations of parties, which, you know, things like the Second and Third International, especially, which is that with these huge, massive organizations, the sort of best rises to the top. There seems to be a very real tendency among those sorts of things to create extremely adept leaders and thinkers and writers that we just don't really see today. And also as far as, and which tells me, I think what that tells me is that while leadership might matter, I think structure still matters more. And you don't really have leadership emerge without like a structure that sort of fosters those sorts of things. I mean, America is actually a pretty decent example when you bring up Abraham Lincoln. Well, you wouldn't have Abraham Lincoln if you didn't have actually a pretty flourishing capitalist democracy that would allow a sort of kid from Kentucky. Was it Kentucky or was it Tennessee? To emerge. Yeah, that's all I really got to say about that.
Derek, and I think we'll wrap up soon enough. So do you want to, unless anybody else wants to get in after Derek, and I think we'll wrap for the evening.
I think Sophie wants to get in after Derek.
Okay.
So I was actually thinking about a lot of what's been said, and I wanted to chime in on the structures. And I'm going to bring this up a lot during when we actually talk about this. But one of the things about when we talk about these strategic things and we set this stuff up, you have to be really thinking about how to set these norms up. And one of the problems that I have had trying to implement things from this book in organizations in my life is that a lot of times the structures of the organizations that you are assimilating into the party or whatever aren't copacetic to doing any of this, and also are like democratic for like the first 50 people who started the group, but not beyond that, because, you know, they set up everything and made it fairly unquestionable. And so as a thing to kind of end off on, and I think in something to be thinking about as we talk about this in the future, maybe wrapping all this up together, how are we going to be applying this when we set up our structures for the orgs and stuff that we want to see, and hopefully eventually a party? Because right now, in the structure of American democracy, I actually really do have a hard time imagining an actual socialist party coming into being that doesn't end up with sectarian tendencies that'll flatten it out before it ever gets started. And that's you know, I don't want to feel that way, but I do. And that's my crucial question is, you know, Ian's got a valid point about these structures, and that's really vital. And that's a big deal. And that's all I have to say. And that's my last point for today.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to quickly respond to Ian and then respond to Derek's kind of final point. I mean, okay, so like this argument about new structures emerging, like oftentimes there's a degree of despotism, and that's maybe perhaps unavoidable. And I think that's really where the dictatorship of the proletariat comes in. Honestly, is that despotism should be aimed at our class enemies and not at other socialists. And I think that's where things really went awry with or went wrong with the Soviet Union, is that it was aimed at other socialists. And so I guess that's really what I'm pointing at, is that like perhaps there is there's some truth to this, that there's going to be some despotism, but I just really caution people against leaning into that too much, And as far as what Derek was talking about, sorry, my dog's barking. Okay, I'm just gonna mute it. Actually, I don't think she's gonna stop.
Is your dog on the stack?
Yeah, that dog is not on stack. Ultimately, what Sophie said is where I would leave it, is that what we want is maximum freedom for the proletariat and for socialists. And then we want to make totalitarian inroads on capital only. And the only reason you resort to this kind of stuff, which might look more like terrifying soft power than any sort of direct terror, is that distinction is very important. I hate to echo Carl Schmitt, because his work leaves no room for a humanist horizon where we can get beyond any kind of antagonism. But it is good to treat friends like friends and not like enemies.
Okay, Sophia, do you want to get back in?
Yeah, just quickly, as far as how I would like to apply these into my organizing, is both the combination of learning from my experience in Redneck Revolt and in organizing in anarchist orgs, and fixing those mistakes, like the idea of being so committed to horizontalism is flawed. You just get people with social capital who are unaccountable, and it's hard to see who has the power and who doesn't, and it's hard to hold people accountable to that, because nominally they're not in positions of power, right? So I think a real version of democratic centralism is necessary, and so is principled non-sectarianism. And as far as applying McNair's ideas in America, I do think we have to approach electoralism from a slightly different angle. Obviously, we'll be getting into that more later, but that's just kind of my broad strokes of what I would like to do with this information.
Okay, is everybody, Alexia, are you finished? Do you have anything to say, or Derek, before we wrap?
I did my wrap. Derek?
Okay. Derek's very good at rapping. Derek, you got a cool street rap.
Yeah. No, I feel like this has been an interesting discussion, and the last thing I think it's gonna. I think actually, interestingly, we have actually staked out a left, a center, and a maybe not a right of this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I would consider myself the left center. So in our micro niche sectarians of one, we can end off on that note that we have already divided up our tendencies.
Oh, wait, if you're center left, then does that make me the left? Heck, I don't know how I feel about this.
Well, I just noticed, I don't know if anybody else noticed that Rosa, Ian, and Donald all left at one thing. So I think there's a split happening. I think they've been.
We split the party already. Holy heck.
I think it's split.
Damn,
It happened all within like 30 seconds. I was like, oh my God, they're at it.
Splitters, all of them.
Not even one fucking show we couldn't get through. No, I'm joking.
Nah, I doubt it. I think it's just been a long night, and
I am joking. Okay, so thanks everybody in the chat. We'll come back next week. I think this week was a very it was kind of rambly. I think, Derek, you're dead right. We can put together just even the main points, and I think we'll see. We'll try and do 1 and 2 next week, Derek. Let's see if we can get points down together in a Google Doc.
Okay, 1 and 2 is ambitious, but if we really can keep some of the sectarian history from bubbling up and keep it to just talking about the international, because I do think we have to talk about that history. I don't think there's a way around that, and then maybe talking about the Bolsheviks, because I do think we are going to have.
Let's just go offline and we can chat. I'll just stop the broadcast in here. Okay, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you everyone for coming. We're not going to read the chat this time, but we love y'all. Thanks for coming.
Ciao.